This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFD Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is our weekly look at all things environmental and community and all sorts of other things like that. Today's date is the 14th. Is that possible? The 14th of August. Good grief. That means the kids are going to be coming back any day now to the university. And, and this is, of course, 2016.
You usually say something about people who've passed and who've made a mark on the community and leave records that will go on for years. Well, Ray Spooner passed. He had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a fatal sclerosis. He was only 57, but he'd been a husband, father, grandfather, cyclist, and also he was a midwife. The Sinai Temple was packed, and various records of his history. He has an English background, and he had an ecumenical enthusiasm, and he was a leader. And once he got ALS, he decided to ride across the country and raised something like $80,000 for ALS research. I spoke to a mother who had been birthed by Ray. She anticipated having to have a pain block, but Ray gave her confidence and she didn't need that. He was good at doing that job. The cortege was interesting. There was about 30 bicycles followed the hearse and probably about a mile and a half of cars to the burial. Virginia Garth passed. She was the wife of Porter Garth. Grew up in northern Missouri, near Truman State College. Met up with Porter Garth. They came to Champaign and bought a farmhouse and land on Curtis Road, just over the railroad line near Route 45. They occupied that farmhouse and ran a landscape business and a nursery. And I often talk to Porter and his wife. She was worked at the veterinary school and was engaged in many community activities, including at IDF, the Disciples Foundation, and with developmental services. The family is historically oriented, and I was pleased to be there for just a little while. Porter was very supportive of prairie efforts, and I knew him pretty well. Turning to salvage, it's a time of the year when students come back and retirees go, and they leave a trail of boxes and throwaway goods that need to be recycled. I would like to remind people to please break your boxes, flatten them, and then evenly distribute them so that they leave room for others. We do not enjoy having a lot of dumpsters with a whole bunch of stuff out in the rain to be picked up wet if it rains. Last week I introduced the topic of a strategic action plan. I haven't had time to do a lot of detail with this, the idea is there, and action plans often start out as an idea, but you need to put them together so that people have a rough idea of what's in your mind so that they can exercise their mind in relation to the idea. It might be that they're diametrically opposed, but that's good to find that opposition. But then again, it might be a matter of educating people as to what you want to do. So I'm going to just do a little imagining here. I have a reasonable background in Prairie, so I thought I would put down some of the concepts that I would like to see. First of all, I see the need for a Center for Prairie Education, and this I see existing at Northern Iowa University, where there's a center with grad students. There's a university with a track record of being very interested in having prairies in and around the campus, and I think that might be a situation where leadership already exists. Darrell Smith is there, and Laura Jackson, and so there's a nucleus onto which we could climb. There are a lot of other states and regions that have facilities, but we're looking for a center, and already the archives of the North American Prairie Conference have been installed in the Northern Iowa University. The theme overall would be biodiversity. My concern and amazement was that most all of the biodiversity has been removed for agriculture, and we're into serious monocultures, and that takes out a lot of the biodiversity that we find very interesting and very hard to reproduce. If you extinct a species, then you're not going to get it back again. So there's no passenger pigeons, and there are a lot of worldwide plants that are disappearing because of monocultural activities. Sure, it feeds the world, but it feeds the world with a very limited spectrum of food. So we need a theme of biodiversity. The target population would be worldwide. I would like to see consideration of other grasslands in Russia and Latin America, and I would orient the center to prairie preservation in the U.S., but with the reservation that we understand the rest of the world and the relationship of our grasslands to other grasslands. For instance, if you're dealing with birds, there's a migration pattern that doesn't confine itself to the U.S. It might start off in northern U.S. and end up in Brazil. So I'm looking for a worldwide concept with a specific interest of prairie preservation. I would tie onto that the ancillary interests of agricultural sustainability, alternate forms of agriculture that may include biodiversity, and especially prairie biodiversity. We would want to involve economic interests because monocultures make money immediately, but the reduction and extinction of biodiversity is would have to be handled by other generations. So we would like to see some feeling for 500 years or 1,000 years hence, and we need to know that those soils will be useful, productive, and natural. And natural doesn't mean that they stay the same as they are in this year. The microorganisms have a dynamics of their own, and we need to encourage that. But we need to encourage it with a view to biodiversity. And a subunit of that is that we need pollinators, because a lot of our vegetables, for instance, are pollinated by wildlife. And if you run around and spray, or you incorporate a chemical within a Roundup soybean seed, then you just don't get the one pest that you're trying to avoid, but you get all the other insects and creatures that work on that plant. So what sort of plan of action could we have? I've mentioned the University of Northern Iowa. I would like to see an academic chair of biodiversity, and I would probably suggest that would be at the University of Northern Iowa. And I would like that sort of person to be involved in the geolandscape, so we know more about our grasslands. I would like to see that person familiar with Dr. Betts and others who have passed on, but who did a lot of work in places like the Chicago area. We need the Wilhelms and others who have generated little prairies in the Chicago area that where there's a little bit more money and a little bit more power. And so there's a history here. I would look for a chair of that dimension. And then I go back to the augmentation of the center that already exists. Darrell Smith has been in charge, and now Laura Jackson is in charge. And that existing situation could be augmented with funding and professional leadership. So how do we do that? How do we provide facilities for undergraduates and graduates that might come in from not only Iowa but from other states? How do we handle library work and archiving? How do we have a physical plant that harvests very biodiverse seed? It can range from tiny little seeds that you can hardly see to fluffy seeds that are awkward to deal with because they blow. And already that center has a lot of physical plant, but we could use more to research seed collection and propagation and augmentation of that site. I would look for a travel budget to allow people to move around locally, as well as to move between states and state resources like a natural history survey in various states, and to facilitate coordination. I'd like a media center of modest means to take the message to the public, because the public doesn't really know or recognize their heritage ecosystem, because there's virtually none left. Even the Grand Prairie Friends runs off and does things with forests because it is so hard to find and preserve little pieces of remnant prairie. when you're down to 1%, less than 1% of the remnant prairie that was in Illinois, for instance, and that was 2/3 of the state, when you're down to that small amount, you need to do something to encourage people to solicit prairie and prairie forest ecosystem research and communication. And you need that to be a regional movement, but also a national movement and an international movement as you get into Canada. I would look to the Conservation Trust organization like the Nature Conservancy and the Land Trust to be supportive agencies and involved in this whole process. Some of these agencies also have a political thrust. So I'd look for people like the Prairie State Conservation Coalition, people who are crediting natural areas and working with IRS, looking at land and biodiversity invasion, and also the preservation of sites that would maintain biodiversity. Then we need to, in this sort of overall strategic action plan, we need to put together specific projects, the existing projects and also conceptual projects that might take us into the future. We have local involvement here, for instance, that has counterpart in other states. We have rails, trails, and greenways, and often a trail like the Kickapoo Trail that's going in between Urbana and Danville has on either side of the ballast where the trail is a little piece of prairie. It's not the ideal prairie, but that's what we have left and have to work with. There are riparian areas. The whole of the Mississippi has been worked in a fashion of polders like you get in Holland. You put up a levee and then work the river bottoms that were traditionally covered with flood every once in a while, and that brought them their fertility, their alluviums, alluvial soils that come from land that is rich. So these are rich bottomlands, and so the Army Corps of Engineers and others are working at taking back some of those bottomlands for restoration of riparian areas, and so some of these areas are large enough to give prairie breathing room to be itself. We need areas that are much better than little strips of railroad bed. There's a move to take the Kankakee Basin, which runs almost from Lake Michigan. You come up over there's some rivulets that run into Lake Michigan, and then there's a rise, and then the water runs through to the Illinois River and down into the Mississippi. But there's a large geological basin there that could be a regional prairie. It doesn't have a lot of remnants on it, but the remnants can be recreated, at least preserving some of the biodiversity. Midewin Prairie, which is near to Joliet, could be a candidate for some ecological support. Then we have to talk to eco-agriculturalists who are looking at the landscape, looking at a savanna forest, looking at the prairie that likes a little bit of shade and sorts itself out as a savanna prairie. We want to see what's in the open prairie. So we teach agriculturalists to, first of all, think about plowing on the contours so that some of the water remains and sinks into the soil. We look for trees that might be rewarding in the sense of providing some seed or food, like you might want a chestnut tree or something that could provide you with a nut or something that's got protein in it and is viable and can be sold. And then you have shrubs that might include grapevines and things that simulate what would be in the traditional ecology of prairie, strong prairie with mostly trees, tall, straight logs that reach to the sky. And then on the edge of that you find savannas where there's a tree that you can recognize by its sort of woolpack nature. It's not got a long, tall stem reaching to the sky. It's got a compact ecosystem. It's slightly outside the forest, and the plants exist around that. And then you might want vines like blackberries or raspberries, and then there are the herbs which could be planted around these trees and shrubs and edge timber. And you might consider simulating a buffalo with the likes of a goat or two. You may need to sort that off. So we need to talk to agriculturalists, and perhaps we have to have erosion control strips that instead of being cultivated grasses that are mown, they might be retained as prairie. And that's a challenge, because if you're going to drive a piece of farm equipment across a grass waterway, if it's growing in prairie at this time of the year, it's 10 foot high, and it takes energy, and you don't exactly know what's in there that you're driving across. So there is a challenge for diverse people to be working with eco-agriculture, and there should be some funding within this plan that heals that territory between monoculture agriculture and biodiversity. Biodiversity not being as economically feasible, but what it does is leave to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation something that's more realistically like the prairie soils that we had. We need to involve reseeding companies that can come to your site, assess it for its soil types, whether they're sandy or clay or heavy in organic matter and low and sort of swampy, and how do we reconstruct those. You might be wanting just 12 species that can look like a prairie and act like a prairie and have deep roots or fibrous roots. But it may be that you want 36 species or 60 species or even 100 species to try and simulate what was, and it's only trying. So to do all this, we need personnel, and we need the names of people, and I've started to think about some of those people that have passed on, that have done a lot of basic work, like Betts and Wilhelm and others. But Darrell Smith has just retired from Northern Iowa University, and he's put together a lot of this sort of thing. And Laura Jackson has replaced him. So Laura Jackson is the daughter of Wesley Jackson, who has a land institute at Salina, Kansas, and so this is something in the family, but it could be very friendly and allow us to think about the people who might person this sort of strategic plan. Roger Anderson is a powerhouse in Bloomington, Illinois. And he's retired, but he's got a continuing interest in this sort of thing. Fran Hardy is in the Nature Conservancy, but he's also been in the State Department of Natural Resources, and so we could add on to this a list of probably 20 or 30 people who have serious commitments to an overall plan. We need to promote that plan. You have to promote at the congressional level, but you also need to promote at the state level, whether that be at the governmental level of natural resources, like the Department of Natural Resources in Illinois or the Illinois Department of Transportation. These people are there and willing and sometimes not very well funded. Like some of our natural resources are only funded by fees that you gather up from hunting licenses and things like that. So it's a very modest experience. So if you have to have committees on endangered species and do the work to survive those species, then you need a budget, and it needs to be promoted at the federal, state, and local level. Somebody needs to be talking to the Rotary Club and local not-for-profits and doing a bit of educating about our plants that look just like weeds but are really not. So I'm thinking of a budget. There's a request for proposal floating around which is for $1 million. And I'm thinking that when you're down to less than 1%, you might really want to consider applying for a major grant like that would not necessarily be for 1 year, but be for perhaps 10 or 15 years so that it could be continued. Some grants continue for a long time. But at least we need to pass this sort of thinking across the books of funding agencies, and so that you get known to the point where something comes along and you have a overall plan, and there's a little piece that you can put together, and bingo, you can perhaps get a small grant that fits into a larger concept.
With that pause, this would be a really good time to jump in and point out this is the Prairie Monk here on WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. It's your chance every single week to find out about things going on in our community. How about if I just mention in really, really briefly here, last week at the end of the show I mentioned that it would be a really bad week this week to go on Clark Street if you're trying to go east-west in Champaign-Urbana. I got to come on Clark Street to come in as I usually do from home to do the show this morning. Clark Street is A-OK. They've already done all of the asphalting of Clark Street. So if you're used to using Clark Street to do your bicycling, it's back and available. There's a tiny little bit right at the very west edge of what they're covering that they're going to have to take care of this coming week. But Clark Street seems to be done at this point. The only thing left to do are all the peripheral streets that go north and south off from Clark Street that have yet to be addressed. If you're used to using McKinley, which is partway along there on North-South Street, they're not touching it, so that one's okay to keep using. So, and with that, back to Dave.
Yes, well, there are things that we can do locally, and I keep mentioning local things, but every community in the region has these sort of projects. One project that we're working on at the moment is to try and get historic trains into Champaign-Urbana. That includes working with railroad people, Canadian National, to try and retain 3 miles of track that is up for abandonment at the moment. That track could be vital if we're going to re-rail an adjacent 4 miles to be adjacent to the Railroad Museum so that we could bring in historic trains occasionally. That project keeps going back and forth with the Surface Transportation Board at Washington. But on either side of that corridor, there are the small pieces of an interurban, and so if you're thinking about doing this, then it needs to be annotated. So I was talking to Peggy Shore, who is a videographer, lecturer, professor at Parkland College, to wonder if there could be photographers who could go out and document this 4 miles of as yet re-railed land, plus 3 miles of already established railroad. That's about 7 miles of railroad that might allow historic trains to come to Champaign. So there's the potential for just a little bit of prairie and the chance to stop at Camp Creek and introduce people to prairie plants that probably haven't been disturbed in 10,000 years. We go back to Lake Park. I've been taking photographs of Lake Park at regular intervals, so we're putting those up on YouTube, and with the help of the Urbana Public Television. And you need to know how to find them, and we need to know how to organize them so you can find them. For instance, if we go to Lake Park, one of the reasons why it's doing very well this year is that it was burned. So how do you find our link or connection to the burn pictures where you show how to burn safely, how to check what remains afterwards. Sometimes you burn a snake or two, or it's different. So the black surface has a character of its own. Different plants burn in a different way. But right now, it's a very interesting prairie because it doesn't have, like Meadowbrook has a wide concrete path with mowing on either side, so it may be even 15 feet or so wide in total. So it takes you away from the prairie a little bit, which is convenient and okay. But Lake Park, you have to push your way through the cordgrass, and you have to lift up the compass plant that's leaning over, and you're there right in amongst, and that is a different sort of prairie. So we're putting those up as a link. And I don't have my computer language straight, so David is very helpful, and he might add a comment here because he says to me, what is it that you want to do, and how can I tell you the computer language, and how do you get access to the 115 YouTube programs we now have, plus this little package of specialty programs that are like Pope Prairie or the Kickapoo Trail or things like that. So let me defer to David for a moment.
Sure. I think what Dave's referring to is the fact that whatever your specialty might be, you not only know how to do your job well, but you have your own vernacular that you use. So when I talk with Dave, he loves the word link, and he uses it all over the place for things that I would never use it for. And so I have to backtrack and ask him, for example, what he just said, what are you trying to get accomplished here? For example, he was just talking about the Lake Park Prairie and the burn recently done on it. And he wanted to know, how do you put things up online so people can find the video? They can say, oh my gosh, you're setting prairies on fire. Isn't that counterproductive? Well, no, just as he says, by getting rid of all of the litter, meaning unnecessary, dead grass and things like that, you allow all the stuff that's down there to come through. And in fact, some of these seeds actually need that fire to germinate. So how do you find this? Go to YouTube online, and I showed him, from having played with computers for a very long time, librarians are getting into the act of this thing right now. It's called information science. How do you type something into the computer, into your favorite browser, to find something, and not just find something, but find something useful? So the secret is, for example, if you go to, if you want to find something about the Lake Park Prairie burn at YouTube, go to YouTube and type into their search window, Lake Park burn. Interestingly, typing in those 3 words will help a lot. And you really want to put quotes around it. Otherwise, you'll find things having to do with lakes, things having to do with parks, and things having to do with burns. And simply putting those quotes around that will help a huge amount. And it's not just on YouTube. Lots and lots of places where you do searches will work much better. If I type my name into a search, my last name is unusual, so I'll find lots of things having to do with me and my immediate family and the Wisconsin folks in my family. But if I want to find things about me personally, I put my name in quotes. There aren't that many people with my first name and last name, and so Googling yourself, for example, will bring your name up, things about you much more directly if you put quotes around your name. Quotes can be your friend to zero in on only things that contain that entire text string and not each and every occurrence of each and every word that you typed in. So I think that's what Dave was referring to. How do people in a particular specialty basically do what doctors must have to do? You go into the doctor and you say, Doc, I think I've got pneumonia. And the doctor says, oh, why? And it turns out you've got anxiety, asthma, or something like that. They have to get past what you think is the situation and get to what the conditions are and how they can help you.
Yes. Going back to the railroading, I was talking to Peg Shore. We might have to make a subsidiary proposal for videographer to work on that corridor. It's not too far from Parkland College, and many of the Parkland College professorial staff lives near this area. It's called Hickory Hill, and then there's a sand lot that is a little further west, and those are people that need to know about this sort of site. They need to be, sometimes they're specialists in this sort of site information, so they need to be purloined to help us define what it is. Where is this herbicide likely to fall underneath the easement for power lines? Where might the ants live? Are there ant nests? Yes, there are ant nests. How do you get across the creeks? Can you put a bridge in? How do we work with volunteers? There's a whole bunch of questions there. And then we, when we do a program, say 2 months ahead now, and we want to refer to Bonneville, to Seymour, to Whiteheath, then we can give you whatever I've been calling is a link or some connection to that information. So we both have regular programs, and in those programs we have to be generous enough to provide you with a comment. Like last week we were dealing with Compass Plant and Dock, and we had a connection to someone from Wolf Road Prairie who had written a little history of those two very deep-rooted plants, and they're 12 feet high at the moment, and I'd like to refer you to that particular document. Then you should be able to get that easily. And in our minds, This is not always simple, and we know that in your minds it's not always simple either. This compass plant relates to 3 sites: Windsor Road, Route 45 South, and Lake Park, and we would like to be able to reference it. So we have a lot of work to do, and we would encourage volunteers to come and do some of that. So that's why I was talking to Peggy Shore to see if she has possibly someone almost at graduate school level who is prepared to do a videographer free, but also to know something about the prairie. You can see from David's comment just now about what burning does. It allows heat and light to get into the plant easily. Then the fact that he is a computer person but knows the territory is very, very helpful. We have the same with a prairie from Monticello to Cisco. At the moment, there's a Monsanto plant on one side of it, there's a library on the other side, and then there's a 30-acre gaming ballpark coming up next door. And so there's traffic. And there, in the midst of that, we have a delightful little remnant prairie. So how do you tell people about that without raising their interest enough that they want to pick the flowers? Sometimes I've been to that little prairie and there's been a florist picking the baptisia because it's nice and white and it does well in vases. So we need to be able to have volunteers to remove invasive olive trees, and that sort of activity needs to be documented visually so that you know what we're doing, because we can't get you to go out 25 miles to this site to watch it 1,000 times a year. We're going to have to be dependent on giving you visual material that helps expose this sort of information. So people like Ron Sleater will come from Decatur and backpack spray, spot spray teasel, and when we cut down an autumn olive tree, we'll herbicide the stump so that it doesn't come back. But that we need to document. It's rather wonderful that somebody is coming to collect the olives that are on these trees. They to look at a mature tree and shake it onto canvas and collect the fruit that then becomes saleable at the farmer's market as a jam. So that process documented helps you understand that by doing so, we're removing several thousand seeds that will just come up and germinate for the next 400 years. So we're doing things in-house to help you understand what we do in the field. In the Rantoul area, we're looking at a trail that might be a prairie interpretive trail that runs from Paxton through to Rantoul on an old road that's not used, but could be used. So then we need people to watch that prairie, to have a video camera or a still camera and take photographs, probably early in the morning so there's not a lot of wind blowing if you're taking still photographs. It might be to do it in the afternoon when you want to see the September grasses blowing in the wind. We need to have diagrams and charts that will show you a cross-section of the Bloomington moraine and how on the Paxton side there's a Paxton moraine, and then there's an outwash plain to the Paxton moraine that runs into a little creek, and then you gradually go up to the Bloomington moraine. At Ludlow there's a low point and then comes up over the hill. So you're looking at soil types and changes. You're looking at loess, which is blowing across the landscape. And so we're needing people who can put in charts and graphs and maps, and we need to be able to find them. And that's been one of our problems lately, is we can't find the map that we made a while ago. Some techniques are very detailed. I've brought in a booklet, and David has a copy too. And on page 51, you can see where stream banks are being restored by the inclusion of things like willow trees. And so there's riprap, but there's also trees amongst the riprap and that embankment. So we got a phone call here.
Keep going.
So just turning the page and looking at how engineers can also work with plants and restore the likes of the Mississippi waterways to the bioengineering of materials. I'm looking at possible land acquisition in Rantoul. There's been a 2-mile rail trail installed on old railroad yards, and it's very popular. But then you need to talk to people who own land in that area. It has the end of the Yankee Ridge moraine, so it's a little bit rolling. It has the elements of an outwash plain that was in front of the Bloomington moraine. And we have it going north from Rantoul. You go up the face of the Bloomington moraine. You have to imagine it's perhaps at one stage there might have been 200 feet of snow on top of that site, but mostly it didn't have that amount of snow. It probably was down to about 4 feet that would melt at that position. If the world room warmed up a little bit, it went the moraine, which is an accumulation of gravel that was carried by the glacier, then it would retreat. If the world got a little cooler, then that moraine would move south. So you'd have a new moraine a little bit further south. Now that sort of movement needs to be explained. It needs for people to use contour mapping to understand when contours are together or apart. There's a difference in the slope. You can almost reconstitute a landscape from your visual looking at the map of the soils and the contours. We would like to think about what might happen in the future. The power plant, the nuclear power plant at Clinton is about to close out. There's some debate about whether it should be subsidized, but it's not making a lot of money at the moment. So what happens to the land that is there? Could this be a site like in Iowa, where a similar site was planned for a nuclear power plant that didn't happen, and it has come up with a few thousand acres of prairie that is enough to allow interaction and to allow buffalo, and to have a $6 million visitor center where children can come, where people can find books, where you have cross sections of soil so that you can see what's going on 10 foot under the ground. You have biologists that are prepared to come from other institutions and study the soils and go back to their home territory, whether it be in Iowa or Illinois or Ohio. They can relate to this site. So could we have a site like that at Clinton if that lake remains and the nuclear power plant closes out? If you can't get people to go out 40 miles to Clinton, can you have a pocket prairie? So we have a pocket prairie that is near enough in town with enough species to let you tell the story of a prairie and what it might be if you look out. So there are people who come by, and eventually that is a starter prairie for people who might be interested. There is a constant wage between people who don't really want you to use herbicides, but it's almost impossible to maintain certain invasive species without spot herbiciding. There's a mowing problem. I had to deal this week with, I put a whole bunch of thistles aside and they were mown. You can mow through a thistle. But what that does is spread the thistle seed. And you were hoping that that would not be the case. You'd put the thistles in a place and perhaps burn them. So we have to educate people who do extensive mowing and often are dealing with invasive species like Canada thistle that they can move around. We have to deal with pollinators. We're dealing with the monarch butterfly at the moment, but the North American Prairie Conference is quick to remind you that monarchs aren't the only butterflies, nor only the only insects. And some of the farm cultivated plants are likely to be also invasive plants of prairie. So a sweet clover, whether it be white or yellow, is a wonderful pollinator. But for us, as a prairie specialist, it's a very invasive weed that challenges other prairie plants. If we look at bees, we have to know about the bees that are in the prairie, which are often very small creatures, and they don't produce a harvestable honey comb that can be worked by Italian bees. So do we put Italian bees on the prairie, or do we try to find out what with bumblebees and other types of bees that are native? So all these little things go together to make it possible that in the future we might have an overall academic and applied prairie research and educational plan that may even have the elements of an international concern for grasslands, whether they be in other parts of the world or in the US. So, 2 minutes, okay. Let me look at my... One of the just interesting things to do is to have someone go out and look at the prairie and just find the art that is in a plant working with another plant. To find a little wasp that's on the edge of a leaf, to be photographically able to take your regular camera and put a little a little lens over the front of your lens and be able to photograph that creature. To find a row of sticks that you wonder why do we have this sort of area of sticks, and then to photograph it. And even if you don't use the photograph, it teaches you to be looking for that sort of thing, and you come to have an understanding. So you don't always have to reproduce your photograph. Just taking a lens and looking at things, carry a lens around your neck and look at the detail. Or sometimes just stand back and look in the distance and see Yankee Ridge as a slight rise, and imagine the glaciation that was there in the past, and where the water was running, and how it merges into the backside of the sloppy backside of the Pisota moraine that generates the Ombra River that goes down in front of it. Just understanding, being curious is very, very helpful to everyone else who has to talk to you. And talking is very, very helpful. It's not very helpful for you to accumulate a lot of knowledge and not be able to transmit it to other people. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.